Welcome to Reformed Thinking, where we take complex biblical and theological ideas and, well, give them a thorough and engaging deep dive. If you've ever felt like you needed a shortcut to genuinely grasping the linguistic and covenantal backbone of the redemptive narrative, focusing on specific detail, you are in the right place. Today, we are looking at a stack of sources that centers entirely on a single Hebrew name, dāwid, and the incredible constellation of related concepts that spring from that three-letter root, DWD. And this isn't a historical biography, it's a linguistic investigation.
That's correct. Our mission today is highly specialized. We are moving past the famous stories, Goliath, Bathsheba, the census, to look at the name itself. We're investigating its spelling, its multiple meanings, and how it functions in Scripture, not just as a personal identifier, but as a robust placeholder for the structure of God's covenantal promises. And, as those who value the heritage of the Westminster Confession, we understand that grasping the Davidic line is absolutely central to understanding the continuity of God's plan of redemption. It defines the messianic expectation, linking the historical king directly to Christology. We are charting the linguistic geography of a divine promise, finding theology buried in orthography.
Okay, let's unpack this. What immediately stands out is just the sheer volume of material tied to this single figure. It's not just a person, it's an entire institution upon which the history of Israel pivots. So where should we begin?
We have to start right at the text itself, looking at the Hebrew script. When you examine the name David throughout the Old Testament, you observe a subtle but a highly telling evolution in its spelling. The earliest, primary, and short spelling is dāwīd, written defectively. However, as we move later in history, we begin to see the slightly fuller spelling, dāwīd.
So we have two forms, distinguished by the presence of that vowel letter, the yud. This isn't just a random choice, is it? It tells us something about the scribal tradition and the dating of the texts.
Precisely. This difference in orthography, the way the word is written, is often a crucial tool for dating textual layers. The short spelling, dāwīd, the one written defectively, appears consistently throughout the earliest historical books. Samuel, Kings, and the main poetic and prophetic texts like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the early portions of Isaiah and Jeremiah. It is the original sparse way the name was noted.
But you mentioned exceptions in Kings, right? Even in that older material.
Yes. There are three interesting exceptions in Kings, where the later, fuller spelling surfaces, 1 Kings 3.14, 11.4, and 36. This sporadic appearance within older material is intriguing and might suggest later editorial updates or preservation issues in those specific verses, but statistically, the defective spelling dominates the early material.
So when we transition into the later books, the texts produced or formalized closer to and after the Babylonian exile, that fuller form, dawa, starts to dominate.
That's exactly what the data shows. Dawa appears mostly in the post-exilic and late prophetic literature, Zechariah, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. This style of writing the name, known as plain writing, where vowel markers are added, was a tendency of later scribal schools. They were concerned with making the text easier to read and pronounce, especially as the original spoken context was changing.
I see. So the spelling variation acts as a kind of literary timeline. It's not just a variation. It tracks the literary history of the text itself, showing us which materials were compiled or standardized earlier versus later. And we have to note that the longer spelling only shows up occasionally in earlier texts like Hosea 3.5 and Amos 6.5, though our sources suggest the reference in Amos 6.5 is sometimes treated as a textual gloss.
A gloss being a later scribal addition intended to clarify or connect the text to established theology. If that reference in Amos is indeed a gloss, it further confirms that the fuller spelling is overwhelmingly tied to the later, post-exilic period of Israel's history. It's a subtle linguistic marker that validates the chronology of the biblical canon itself.
Okay, shifting from the orthography to the semantic meaning, what does this name actually convey? What is the meaning baked into that root, DWDD?
Well, the standard, most accepted etymology is that dāwīd means beloved. It is widely believed to be a passive participle derived from the root dāwāt. This is the meaning that was universally accepted in tradition, profoundly influencing the theological use of the name. He is, quite literally, the beloved one.
But this is where the scholarly theories get complicated. Our sources mention alternate suggestions that challenge this simple, elegant meaning.
They do, and it's crucial to present the full picture. We have to address the alternate, more scholarly suggestions that were proposed in the past. One suggestion links the name to a different kinship term, potentially meaning father's brother. This would simply be a standard, perhaps tribal name choice. However, the most startling theory, mentioned in the sources by Sayce, proposes that the name dāwīd might have originally derived from dodo, Say suggested Dodo was a title for a sun god worshipped in Israel. This idea connects to the occurrence of a related term, dwdh, which appears in some source material as a female deity name among East Jordan Israelites.
Wow, that brings a crucial historical tension to light. If that theory holds even a fraction of truth, it suggests that there may have been a historical pressure, or perhaps even a theological agenda, to fix the name's meaning and tradition as beloved one. To purify it from any potentially pagan undertones or simple tribal meaning.
That's a very sharp observation. Whether the pagan link is correct or not, the decision by the biblical writers and theologians to settle on beloved is arguably a deliberate theological statement. It elevated David's status from a mere king to a man singularly favored by Yahweh, setting the stage for the covenant, which, after all, is predicated on God's choice and affection. The name becomes a prophecy of election.
Now let's return to the numbers. Given this rich linguistic background, how often does this name actually appear? When you start tabulating the raw frequency, you realize the sheer scale of his centrality to the entire story.
The frequency is astounding. Our sources calculate the short form, dāwîyd, appears approximately 790 times, and the long form, dāwîyd, appears about 276 times. That brings us close to 1,066 total mentions throughout the Hebrew canon.
Think about that, over 1,000 times. That staggering number alone demonstrates that David is not just a character in the narrative. He's the axis upon which the entire history of God's dealing with Israel turns, particularly after the foundation of the monarchy.
And we can contextualize the moment this pivotal name enters the sacred story. His first specific mention is in 1 Samuel 16.13, where the prophet Samuel anoints him. It's the moment the Spirit of God rushes upon him, officially transforming him from a simple shepherd into the consecrated king-elect. That anointing is the watershed moment.
And beyond the historical narrative, the name's frequency is exponentially boosted by its association with the Psalter. David's legacy as the great psalmist dictates the very structure of Israel's worship.
It does. His name appears in the titles of 73 psalms. This is not incidental. This attribution defines the spiritual landscape of the nation.
73 psalms. That's a huge block of Israel's hymnody, including Psalms 3 through 9, Psalms 11 through 32, a large collection from 34 to 41, and then another significant group from 51 all the way to 65. Then you have later Psalms like 108 through 110, 122, 124, 131, 133, and 138 through 145.
This attribution, whether David wrote all of them or whether later editors simply assigned them to him as the patron of worship, imposes a critical theological framework. It establishes David not just as the author, but as the normative voice of corporate worship, expressing the entire range of covenant experience, from desperation and lament to exultant praise and confidence in God's rule.
Right, it sets the lens. When the nation sings these songs, they are doing so under the liturgical guidance of the Davidic king, interpreting their relationship with God through his experience.
And we also see the name dāwîyd woven into the text of other psalms, reinforcing this connection, even when the title is absent. For instance, Psalm 18.51, which is directly paralleled in 2 Samuel 22.51, and Psalm 72.20, which concludes the second book of the Psalter. The memory and identity of David defines the spiritual life and theological reflection of the covenant people. David's political and dynastic identity is the primary engine of his theological significance in the Old Testament. He is the son of Jesse, the king whose dynasty held the throne of Jerusalem until the Babylonian exile. This reality was established in texts like 2 Samuel 7.11-15, which established the permanence of his family line in redemptive history, subject to the covenant.
And this political reality is informalized through some key titles that reflect his role within God's sovereign plan.
Yes. One of the most critical titles is when David is addressed as the servant of Yahweh, or Amadi. What's key here is that this is a formal designation used almost exclusively when the Lord himself speaks about David. We find this in 2 Samuel 3.18, 7.5, and 7.8. and repeatedly in 1 Kings.
That title shifts the focus entirely. It signifies that David's kingship is not autonomous, it is delegated. His rule is completely authorized by God and serves God's larger purposes. It's a theological title for a political office.
Exactly. Even after his death, God speaks of the dynasty in terms of "my servant David" to guarantee continuity. For those of us who appreciate the Reformed understanding of magistracy, this title establishes David as the original exemplar of a God-ordained ruler, accountable to a higher covenant.
And that connection becomes even more specific when we see phrases that explicitly link him to God's covenantal name. The sources highlight the title Elisha the Way, the God of David, appearing in 2 Kings 20.5.
That title is powerful. It appears in the context of the prophet Isaiah addressing King Hezekiah during a mortal illness. God tells Isaiah, "Return and say to Hezekiah, the leader of my people, thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer."
So the covenant isn't referenced generically. It is invoked personally through the figure of David. It suggests that David is not just a king chosen by God. He is a personal focal point for God's covenantal relationship with the nation. And God responds to the current king based on the fidelity established with David.
It grounds the present hope in the past promise. Now let's consider the specific places and structures associated with his name, because these are conceptual centers of worship and authority. The most famous, of course, is the city of David, erotic.
Our sources define the city of David primarily as the stronghold or citadel of Zion. It's the secure heart of his kingdom, which he wrestled from the Jebusites and made his capital.
The physical geography of the city of David is fundamentally linked to David's legacy, but its function quickly transcends military strategy. What gives it theological weight is its specific association with the burial site of the kings.
That's a fascinating detail. It's not simply a place name, but the physical repository of the dynastic promise itself.
Scripture meticulously records that the kings of the line, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijam, and so on, were buried there. We see it in 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Even Jehoiada, the priest who saved the Davidic line, was accorded the privilege of being buried there. The continuity of the king, even in death, is tied to this specific sacred geography. The promise of perpetuity is literally grounded in that plot of land.
We also see the institutional terms that define his lineage and authority across time. The House of David, Bedoa, denoting his immediate family and all his descendants.
This term carries both political and theological freight. Politically, we see it in the intrigue surrounding the kingdom's early division in 2 Samuel. But its theological weight shines brightly in the prophets, particularly during times of crisis. Look at Isaiah 7, when Ahaz is facing invasion. The prophet confronts the king, stating that the danger is not just against the nation, but against the house of David. The future of Judah is synonymous with the survival and fate of this particular lineage.
And of course, the symbolic apex of his authority, the throne of David, Kisidoi.
This is the absolute symbol of dynastic rule and permanence, the physical assurance of the promise in 2 Samuel 7. We encounter this phrase repeatedly from the accounts of succession in 1 Kings and crucially in the promises of the prophets, such as Isaiah 9.6 and Jeremiah 17.25. The stability of that throne is presented as the guarantee of God's covenantal order. If the throne is stable, the covenant holds.
Okay, moving from these physical and political symbols to the liturgical and prophetic structures, the sources also highlight the tent and the booth named after him. These shift the discussion from historical reality to eschatological hope.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
We find the tent of David, Jodaway, mentioned in Isaiah 16.5. A tent inherently implies temporary lodging or presence, yet here it is linked to the establishment of stability. It says, "In steadfast love, a throne will be established, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David one who judges."
So even in this temporary image of a tent, the promise is the establishment of ease and judgment, the ultimate Davidic virtues.
Correct. But even more striking is the booth of David, Sukkah Daweh, which appears in Amos 9:1-11. A booth, or sukkah, is even more temporary than a tent. We know these from the Feast of Booths, where Israel dwelt in flimsy temporary shelters to remember their wandering in the wilderness and their dependence on God.
Right, the booth is the image of extreme fragility.
Precisely. Amos's prophecy speaks of the time when the Lord will raise up and restore this fallen booth. This isn't just a metaphor for a little damage. The word fallen implies total collapse, signifying the complete degradation and political destruction of the Davidic dynasty after the exile. The monarchy was reduced to absolutely nothing.
That context makes the promise so much more powerful. If the dynasty is reduced to a flimsy, collapsed shelter, the restoration promised by God must be monumental.
It is. The use of David's name here guarantees the coming restoration of his kingship. The promise isn't that a new king will come, it's that the Davidic rule, the sovereign standard of justice established by the Beloved One, will be revived, and it will encompass the nations. This takes the discussion entirely out of history and projects it onto the final messianic future. This transition leads us directly from the historical king to the theological promise, which is the cornerstone of a Reformed understanding of Christology. David, in prophecy, transcends history and becomes the messianic prototype.
So the name dāwid literally becomes a title.
It does. The name dāwid denotes the coming Messiah, who is the son of David, ben Doa. When the prophets speak of a future ruler, They often default to using David's name as a stand-in for the ideal, covenantally promised king, the ultimate servant. We see this substitution explicitly in the post-exilic prophecies. Ezekiel 34 and 37 refer to a future shepherd and ruler who will rule over Israel, and that ruler is simply called David. Similarly, we find this usage in Hosea 3.5 and Jeremiah 30.9. These texts are using David's name not to predict a historical return, but to represent the culmination of the covenant given to him, a perfect eternal rule.
So the prophets are affirming continuity through discontinuity. When the earthly throne fails during the exile, the promise isn't revoked. Instead, God simply promises that the rule defined by David will be perfectly realized in the future.
Absolutely, and this realization centers entirely on God's fidelity to his word. This brings us to a phrase found in the sources that we have to analyze in depth: the mercies of David, Ezra.
Defining East is always so vital for understanding covenant theology. Our sources point us to 2 Chronicles 6.42 and, more significantly, Isaiah 55.3, where this phrase appears. Before we link it to David, what exactly are we talking about when we say East?
East is a robust term that we can't translate with a single English word. It denotes loyal duty, steadfast fidelity, and committed enacted love within a relationship, specifically a covenantal relationship. It is not just mercy or kindness. It is the active, reliable behavior that you're obligated to display toward the covenant partner. It's what God must do because of who he is and what he has promised.
Okay, so linking that kind of intense, loyal fidelity specifically to David Dāwîd implies that God's reliable behavior is specifically defined by the terms of the Davidic covenant from 2 Samuel 7.
That is the crucial insight. God's faithfulness is tied to the guarantee that a son of David will always occupy the throne, and that even when that son fails, God will not remove his heirs from David's line, though he may punish the individual king. The promise of perpetuity is rooted in God's specific loyalty to David. Now look at Isaiah 55.3. This chapter is a promise of restoration following the exile. The prophet is extending those highly secure, eternal covenant promises, referring to them as the sure mercies of David and applying them to the entire community of exiled Israel.
That's a powerful theological move, especially for a people who have just experienced the utter failure of the physical monarchy.
It connects their future security directly to the past certainty of David's covenant. The people are assured that the exile has not canceled God's promises. The certainty of God's covenant with David, which was seemingly secure and eternal, becomes the foundation for the security of Israel's return and restoration. It guarantees God's continuing faithfulness regardless of the darkness they endured. The resurrection of the dynasty is synonymous with the restoration of the covenant community.
This moves David from a successful political figure to a spiritual mediator. And finally, in this section, we must look at David not just as the political king, but as the man of God.
The formal, revered designation, dāwīd, David, the man of God, appears in Nehemiah 12.36. It places David in the revered company of Moses and other prophets.
What's instructive here is the context in Nehemiah. It appears specifically in relation to the musical instruments of song, keli shir. Why is that connection so vital?
It ties his historical role as king directly to his essential spiritual role as the psalmist and regulator of worship. It shows that his sovereignty was manifested not just through the military, but through the temple. It confirms that David was the one who instituted the instruments, the structure, and the personnel of the temple liturgy.
So his kingdom was defined by justice and by organized corporate praise. He established the theological and liturgical rhythm of the nation. The name David means beloved, and as the man of God, he was beloved for establishing the very means by which Israel expressed their reciprocal love and adoration for Yahweh.
The dynasty isn't just about ruling people. It's about ordering their relationship with God.
So if the name David stabilized the political future of Israel and guaranteed the messianic promise, the shared linguistic root dāwīd itself shows us how deeply that concept of beloved or friendship was wired into their everyday lexicon. And it connects the sacred to the shockingly profane. We are transitioning now to the noun dāwīd.
Right. Dāwīd has a striking and highly contextual duality in its meaning. Because the core root is about close affection or intimacy, it can swing between the familial and the erotic. It can mean either beloved lover or uncle.
So you have to determine which meaning is intended based on the surrounding text, but the underlying concept connecting the two is kinship and intimate affection.
In the vast majority of cases outside of the Song of Songs, dāwīd functions strictly as a kinship term, almost always meaning uncle. It defines the close male relative on the father's side, as seen in Leviticus and Jeremiah. It is a stable, important role in the family structure.
But then we encounter this radical semantic shift inside the Song of Songs, where the language of the court, the king, and the covenant is completely stripped down and reapplied to human passion.
Indeed. In this Song of Songs, the term dāwid is used 39 times, and here it is exclusively defined as beloved or lover by a woman, and it is used in a highly erotic context. The language is intense and direct. For example, Song 4, Point Scene, where the woman praises the man's affection, saying, "How much better is your love, dough, than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice."
That usage confirms the root's capacity to express deep, intimate, sexualized affection. The word that defines God's chosen king, the beloved, is the same word used to describe intense human romantic longing. The language of covenant and the language of courtship share the same linguistic DNA.
And we have to note the one exception outside of the Song of Songs that pushes that intimate meaning into a destructive, negative context.
Proverbs 7.18 in the narrative of the adulteress.
That's right. Here the term refers to an adulteress attempting to seduce an unwise man, urging him to, "Come, let us take our fill of dāwid," or illicit passion. This reinforces the erotic connotation, but places it clearly within the bounds of illicit, dangerous behavior. The semantic range is tied to intimacy, whether sanctioned, familial, or forbidden.
Okay, let's move to perhaps the most curious application of this root, which ties the idea of love and kinship directly to ancient biological desperation: mandrakes.
We're talking about dūdam, literally meaning love fruits or mandrakes. The plant itself is described in our sources as having purple flowers, yellow fruits, and a forked root. It's not just a plant, it has a reputation tied directly to the root dāwid.
And that reputation is entirely linked to fertility and sexual desire.
Absolutely. The fruit was used traditionally as an aphrodisiac, noted specifically for its capacity to excite sexual desire and to favor procreation. This belief gave the plant immense cultural weight in a society where childbearing was paramount.
And the most dramatic biblical context for the mandrakes is the narrative of the patriarchs, specifically the high-stakes family drama in Genesis 30, involving Rachel and Leah. This is a story that grounds the root dūdud in human desperation.
It's a perfect illustration of the depth of this belief. Rachel, who is infertile, desperately wants the mandrakes from Leah, who receives them from her son Reuben in the harvest fields. Rachel is so desperate for the perceived fertility boost that she trades Jacob's conjugal time with her for the fruit.
So she essentially trades the certain means of conception, her husband's attentions, for the supposed magical means of the mandrakes.
It shows the extent of their belief in the fruit's efficacy and the desperation of infertile women in that era. The struggle over the dūdadim highlights this desperate, deep, human hope for fertility, connecting the root dūdad not just to abstract love, but to the very continuance of the human line, which of course is necessary for the continuance of the Davidic line.
The mandrake also appears in the Song of Songs, connecting it back to the central erotic theme of dāwid.
In Song of Songs 7.12, the lovers are heading out to the fields, and the woman points out, "The mandrakes yield their odor." The fragrance of this fruit, with all its traditional associations, becomes an intoxicating, almost cultic part of the lover's setting.
So we have the king, the covenant, the uncle, the lover, the aphrodisiac fruit, all bound by this singular linguistic concept of beloved or intimacy, but the root also connects to something utterly mundane and utilitarian.
The final necessary aspect of this lexicon is the term dūd, which means pot, jar, or basket. This demonstrates the wide reach of this three-letter root in every facet of Israelite daily life. The same letters that denote the Messianic covenant also denote the cooking equipment.
It's used initially as a cooking vessel, right? A common
Sorry?
pot or kettle used for boiling?
That's its most common use. It's seen in 1 Samuel 2.14, mentioned alongside other common cooking instruments. We also see it mentioned in 2 Chronicles 35.13 as a pot used for boiling meat during the Passover celebration. It's a standard piece of household hardware.
But it's also used as a large container or basket for carrying goods. And sometimes the context for that usage is quite unsettling, creating a sharp contrast with the name David.
The breadth of the usage provides a really dramatic contrast. As a basket, its function can be quite mundane. Jeremiah 24 uses it to describe a basket used to carry figs. Psalm 81 suggests it was a heavy container used to carry burdens like clay or bricks. But then we get the gruesome, jarring example in 2 Kings 10.7. The word dūd is used to describe the containers, the baskets, used to carry the heads of the 70 sons of King Ahab, delivered to Jehu in Jezreel.
Wow. That one word, dude, encompasses the full semantic spectrum of Israelite experience, from the boiling pot on the fire to the common carrier of figs to the gruesome container of war trophies. It's a reminder that even the loftiest theological terms are built upon the shared, gritty vocabulary of everyday life.
To synthesize this linguistic deep dive, a single linguistic root, dāwîd, connects the greatest historical king of Israel, David, whose dynasty grounds the eternal messianic covenant, to kinship, to intense, intimate passion, to the desire for procreation with the mandrakes, and finally to common household items like pots and baskets.
That analysis shows how the Davidic line represents not just political succession, but the faithful continuation of God's beloved promise. It makes the entire messianic narrative deeply personal, drawing on the most intimate language of love and belonging that exists in the Hebrew language. The name is the message. The king is the beloved. The covenant is loyal affection.
David's history, his failures and triumphs, become secondary to the name's theological function as the embodiment of covenantal fidelity, the certainty of God's loyal love.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Considering the root meaning of the name David is simply beloved, reflect on the messianic rule mentioned in Ezekiel and Hosea, where the future king is simply called David. The greatest king who is to come, the one who fulfills the entire covenant, is introduced simply as God's beloved son. Ponder how the specific detail of the name David points us directly to the character of the ruler. He is the one chosen and loved by God, and he is the one who will restore the relationship between God and his people based not on conquest or political machination, but on that definition of loyal affection and fidelity.